triggered off the Korean War? Who started the Korean War on June the 25th, 1950? It is long time ago that the United States designated Korea as a combat base for the realization of its strategy of world supremacy. In 1945, U.S. President Truman, in his message to Congress, claimed that the United States should dominate the world and called for a new war in Korea. On September 8, 1945, Hodge, commander of the U.S. Army in South Korea, proclaimed like this: "The sole government of South Korea is the military government established by the order of the Supreme Commander of the U.S. Army. The military government replaces the Japanese military administration." Arnold, the first chief of the military government, made public an ordinance to begin to organize the South Korean puppet army. The United States disbanded people's committees across South Korea by the bayonet and prohibited the activities of all democratic parties and public organizations in South Korea. The United States fabricated the Syngman-Rhee puppet regime in South Korea and egged it on to a war against the North. South Korea was turned into prison without bars, in which peace and democracy were totally trampled underfoot. It was wrapped in a warlike atmosphere. The United States forcibly gave military education and training to students and other young and middle-aged men, numbering 1,250,000. The United States developed the already formed border garrison to national army and gave military education and training in an American way. Under the pretext of aid and additional aid, the United States handed a large amount of war supplies and arms and equipment over to the South Korean puppet army and accelerated preparations for northward invasion. Entering 1949, the United States gave rise to lots of armed invasion incidents in the 38th parallel area as a test war. After the Second World War, the United States was faced with a catastrophic economic crisis, and then the U.S. monopolistic plutocrats urged the White House to take a shocking step. The White House opened a new way out in a Korean War. Japan, too, was rapidly converted into an attack base, repair base, and war supply base of the United States. Japan accelerated major construction projects at the Okinawa Air Base for the Korean War, and newly built or rehabilitated hundreds of military bases on 4 islands, and thus turned them into complete strategic bases. American political and military bosses traveled to South Korea more frequently. U.S. Ambassador to South Korea, Mucho, showed up at the 38th parallel. Around that time, the United States worked out a war plan operation map and urged the South Korean Puppet Army to perpetrate armed invasion in a more undisguised manner. At secret talks with Syngman Rhee in Tokyo in mid-February 1950, MacArthur, commander of the U.S. Far Eastern Forces, gave 11-point instruction to ignite a Korean War before July. In a letter to his political advisor to Washington, Syngman Rhee said, "Now is the most proper time for us to take an offensive measure." On June 17, 1950, John Foster Dulles flew into South Korea as a presidential envoy to finally examine war preparations and fix war date and time. The following day, he inspected the military demarcation line. Leaving Seoul, Dulles wrote to Syngman Rhee as follows: "I attach a great significance to a decisive role your country would play in the ongoing great drama. After reviewing a parade of the U.S. Far Eastern Forces in front of the Royal Palace in Tokyo, MacArthur met with the U.S. Defense Secretary, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Dulles on June the 22nd. The four-man talks decided to trigger off a Korean War on June the 25th, 1950. Robert, chief of the U.S. Military Advisory Group, said to Syngman Rhee like this: "We have chosen the 25th, and this explains our prudence. It is Sunday. It is the Sabbath for both the United States and South Korea, Christian states. No one will believe we have started a war on Sunday." According to a secret order, airmen of the U.S. Far Eastern Forces assumed a combat standby posture. An order of emergency alert was issued to the whole South Korean Puppet Army at the 38th parallel. In an attempt to cover the start of war, the crafty United States organized a weekend rest of officers of the MacArthur Command at Nikko, a recreation resort of Japan, and saw to it that bogus frontline officers enjoyed dancing at a club for officers in Seoul. A few hours before the start of war, families of the U.S. Army officers were evacuated to Japan stealthily aboard a Norwegian ship. People in the north of Korea, however, were spending an ordinary day on June 24, Saturday, too. Four o'clock in the morning of June the 25th, 1950, the United States instigated the South Korean army to unleash a war against the North, and availing itself of temporary superiority, invaded to the inland 2 kilometers north of the 38th parallel. Afterwards, MacArthur in his book admitted that the Army of the North had been placed for defense, not for attack. That's why the world public says the military demarcation line, as well as the Korean War, were all caused by the United States. The United States dispatched more than 2 million troops to the Korean War and applied the most barbarous war means and methods unprecedented in the world history of war. The United States is the very author of the Korean War. Today, too, the United States is persisting in the moves to isolate and stifle the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and at the same time, frantically staging provocative war games on a large scale almost every day. The United States miscalculates. It must look straight at the Democratic People's Republic of Korea of today that has grown stronger under the Sungun policy. Under the leadership of Supreme Commander of the Korean People's Army, Kim Jong-il, the Korean Army and people will be ever victorious in showdown with the U.S. imperialists.